Hello and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode we will be looking at early Greek philosophy. The purpose of this episode is to give a brief introduction to the wide and diverse field of early Greek philosophers. By the end of this episode, by no means will I have given a definitive account of the early Greek philosophers. However, I hope to have introduced you to the most important names and also to give you access to some of the resources that you require so that you can go and study the early Greek philosophers in your own time. I want to begin this episode with two disclaimers. Firstly, I want to talk about the term early Greek philosophers rather than the more commonly utilized term Presocratics. I have been using this term early Greek philosophers because I think it's important to consider these thinkers in their own right, rather than merely as those that are coming before Socratic thought. Secondly, I want to talk about the term fragments. All of these thinkers only survive in fragmented form. And when we say fragments, we don't mean that their thought survives in partial parchment copies or partial papyrus scrolls which have been badly damaged, but rather that they survive as quotations by later authors. And as such, we need to consider the fact that these thinkers have in themselves not had their thought entirely directly communicated to us, but merely given to us as the biased understanding of those later authors. The first thinker we'll talk about is Thales of Miletus. Now, Thales was born on the west coast of Ionia, and what I mean by that is, if you look at what is now called Turkey, on the southwest coast, you have an area which was settled by Greek colonists through an explosion of settlements from about 1000 to 600 before current era, and one of these settlements was known as Miletus. He was heavily influenced by Egyptian mathematics and Babylonian astronomy. It's in tradition that he went to Egypt to receive education at the hands of the priests there. Now, Thales is known as the first of the Milesian school, and this is a school which was seen as positing a primal substance from which the world began. And Thales is, as the first of this line of thinkers, posits that substance as water. He also was known as a bit of a scientific mind in the fact that he predicted an eclipse, and he also predicted a large olive harvest. However, this is likely legendary. It's because this comes from a legend in which Thales, using his philosophical knowledge, was able to predict a future olive harvest, which was going to be quite large. Now, at the time, he was dressed in rags and seen as a pauper, but with his knowledge, he was able to put a very small down payment on all the local olive presses. And so when the time came for harvest, and there was this massive olive harvest, for very little money, he'd been able to get hold of these very important machines for converting olives into olive oil, and as such was able to charge whatever he wanted for them. And this was meant to demonstrate that philosophers had the knowledge to make money, but they didn't do so because they were more worried about the reality of the world as opposed to the material benefits they could gain from their knowledge. The next thinker is the student of Thales, a man by the name of Anaximander. Now, Anaximander also lived in Miletus on the southwest coast of Ionia, but instead of positing water as the primal substance, he instead posited this concept of the unlimited. And it's from this unlimited, with a division of opposites that exist within the unlimited, that the universe comes to exist. The final mind of the Milesian school is Anaximenes. Anaximenes was either the friend or student of Anaximander, and instead of positing the unlimited, he posited the physical substance of air as the primal substance. And although this may seem like a withdrawal from a more abstract mode of thinking, in some ways Anaximenes provides a very important aspect of understanding within the entire concept of the cosmos of this Milesian school, and that is that process of generation through a process he called felting, which draws upon the common understanding of the way that felt is created through the use of heat, water, and pressure. So it now comes time to examine this Milesian school in its entirety, from Thales all the way through to Anaximenes. Now, historically, even those in the near contemporary time frame of these thinkers They saw the Milesian school as material monists, people that were positing a single primal substance from which the entirety of the world was generated. And this in some ways is correct, but in some ways I see it as being incorrect. And this is because labeling them as material monists, it assigns to them ideas and thoughts that will only come later to early Greek philosophy. Rather, I would see the Milesian school as that of generating substances. They see a single primal substance which is destroyed as it turns into other substances, and as such creates the universe as we comprehend it. For Thales, he saw water as turning into air in the form of evaporation, into fire in the form of conflagration, and then into earth in the form of condensation. In some ways, this could be seen as earth falling out of the water as it's carried downstream and silting up a river mouth would seem like water turning into earth. Water would seem to turn into air as it evaporates out of a dish. And then if fire is denied access to air, it's seen as starving, running out of oxygen. Anaximander, on the other hand, he saw a problem with Thales' ideas, and that is that he was positing a primal substance, which meant that it was above and beyond the other substances. And as such, he abstracted this primal substance and created the unlimited. And from the unlimited, he created these separations on the basis of things that were cold, so water and earth, things that were hot, so fire and air, things that were wet, water and air, and things that were dry, fire and earth. But there's still a difficulty within this generating substance hypothesis, and this is where Anaximander comes in. Anaximander creates a way, a method in which these different elements can turn into each other. Through rarefication, air can become lighter, less dense, and turn into fire. And through a process of condensation, it becomes heavier, becoming clouds or mist, then water, then earth, then stones. And here we see the Milesian school has created this generating substance theory, this theory of elements destroying themselves through a process of either rarefication and condensation and becoming all the elements that we see in the cosmos. Having finished examining the Milesian school, I now want to look at another thinker which started his career in Samos, so near the Ionian coast, but ended up moving all the way to Croton, which was a city in the vicinity of Italy, and founded what would become the Western school of Greek thought. And this thinker is Pythagoras. Now, Pythagoras, like the Milesian school, was influenced by Egyptian and Babylonian thought, but also by potentially Indian sources, although this is heavily contested and there's no positive evidence for this Indian influence. The only definite theory that we can assign to Pythagoras and his early followers is the idea of the transmigration of souls. And this is this very Indian concept of the soul transferring from one body to another after death. And this is where the posited transference of Indic thought to the Greek world has occurred. His later followers ascribed numerical intelligibility to the world. And what I mean by this is that these Pythagoreans thought that the world could be understood in the abstract through the use of numbers. Now, at the same time, I don't want to overemphasize the rationality of the early Pythagorean sect, because it's also somewhat a mixture of religion and philosophy. Those that would be less kind would describe what Pythagoras was running in the south of Italy as a cult. And towards the end of his career, the Pythagoreans were driven out of power in Croton, and many of his followers were killed by angry citizens who saw the followers of Pythagoras as representing something impious and outside of the Greek world. Now, the first follower of Pythagoras to write his own work was a fellow by the name of Philolaus. Now, he also lived and worked in the south of Italy, and he held some ideas which we believe can be assigned to the later Pythagoreans. He saw the cosmos as a harmony of limited and unlimited factors, and he also posited the conception of the heliocentric cosmos. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this very first understanding of the heliocentricity, partially because it's not based upon any sort of real observation so much as the religious numerical beliefs of the Pythagoreans, and also because it was really a one-off. It wasn't replicated, and the actual idea of this heliocentric universe died off shortly after Philolaus's death. So we now turn to the thought of the early Pythagoreans. And it's important to note that we know very little about them due to the fragmentary nature of the corpus, but also because of the secrecy which surrounded the Pythagorean sect. We do know that following Pythagoras, there was different Pythagoreans who ascribed their later thought back to the original founder. And we do know that some of these later thinkers saw a unity in opposites that was very similar to later thinking in China with regards to yin and yang. So this cycle of life and death, of hot and cold. We also see an interest in the concepts of harmony and the ratios in which different sounds mesh together. And also the borrowing of concepts from other forms of mathematics in Babylon and Egypt, including the famous Pythagorean theorem. It's important to note that the Pythagorean theorem itself was known over 400 years earlier in Babylon. However, it's the abstraction of these mathematical concepts to an overarching understanding of the cosmos based upon pure mathematics that really sets the Pythagoreans apart. However, once again, as I've stated before, I don't want to overemphasize the rationality of Pythagorean thinking. We need to remember that they're also a mystical sect who practiced vegetarianism and had very odd prohibitions, including a prohibition on the eating of beans. This could possibly be related to the conception of the bean representing the male testicle, or a report that a bean covered with dung for a period of 2 weeks would take the shape of a man. Now, following in this Western school of Greek thought, we see the next thinker, Xenophanes of Colophon, who started his career in southwest Italy. He rejected the anthropomorphization of the gods, which is something implicit in the earlier cosmologies of the Milesians, but he also saw the cosmos as going through cycles of wet and dry. And it's rather contentious, but he's believed to be the first thinker to use physical evidence to support a theory, where he used aquatic fossils in areas that were now dry land to support the theory that there had been periods of the Earth's history where all the land had been covered by water. Returning to the Ionian coast, we see the next thinker, who was known as Heraclitus, sometimes known as Heraclitus the Obscure, because of his difficulty to be understood by the layperson. Now, Heraclitus potentially was influenced by the Persian Empire, and this is not beyond the veil of belief, because the area of the Ionian coast was under the control of the Persian kings. He posited a cosmos that, instead of arising from a single substance or going through a cycle of substances, was in a constant state of flux. However, it was through this flux he saw a greater unity, which he proclaimed as a unity of opposites, where hot and cold were the same thing, merely by the relationship of temperature. Beneath this cosmology was posited the idea of the guiding principle of fire, or the logos, relationship or thought. Now, this fire is where this insinuation of influence from the Zoroastrian religion comes, because of the importance of the sacred fire in Zoroastrian practices. So with these two thinkers, Xenophanes and Heraclitus, we start to see the generating substance theory in crisis. Xenophanes rejected anthropomorphization of gods, something that was implicit in the Milesian school, but he also rejected the Milesian school's primal substance, in the sense the primacy of one generating substance over another, in his own theory of the cycle of these wet and dry periods. Heraclitus took this criticism of the Milesian school even further. One of his aphorisms is that you can never step into the same river twice. And by this he is insinuating that there is no primal substance, there is no substance that can be lent upon as a basis for reality. And this is seen even more particularly in his use of the fire as the primal substance. The fire in itself is constantly moving. It's never the same shape, it's never the same size, and it's constantly consuming, and it's always about to go out. He tries to point out how in reality all things have this sense of flux in the way that they are used and the way that they act. He states the road is the same on the way up and the same on the way back, trying to show and demonstrate through a practical metaphor how the one thing can appear as different despite an underlying unity. He attempts to describe reality as a bow or a lyre bending back upon itself. And it's in this sense he sees through the flux, through this perception of constant change, a greater overarching unity. The next thinker is possibly one of the most important of the early Greek philosophers, and this is Parmenides of Elea in southwestern Italy. He attempted to demonstrate the necessity of being and the impossibility of not being, in direct answer to the issues of the generating substance theory. For Parmenides, it was the thesis that either things could exist or couldn't exist which fascinated him. He attempted to demonstrate that if we took motion to be real, if we took the world to exist in parts as opposed to being a whole, we would have to accept the thesis of non-being. And in his mind, if we were to attempt to conceive of something not existing, this would create a logical inconsistency in our own minds. He saw that things could only exist or not exist. And as such, to talk about there being a separation of parts was to be talking about things not being something. And as such, he was positing this radical concept of being. And it is this radical concept which will dominate the thought post-Parmenides and which will heavily influence those that either attempt to incorporate his concept of being and then also explain the perception of actual reality, which includes parts and motion, and those that would deny perception as a guide to understanding reality, which was truly one, as opposed to the plurality that we see in everyday life. So with the more recent philosophers that we've talked about, we've seen a radical break, a radical change which shapes early Greek philosophy going forward. However, it's important to reflect on what the relationship between these different thinkers is. Now, it has been suggested as possible that this relationship is a relationship between Parmenides' thesis of the radical being, which is an organic growth out of this Milesian school, and in this sense, they see Xenophanes and Heraclitus as merely a continuation of this material monism. And this is this thesis, once again, that everything is made of an underlying substance. However, if we're to accept this, we don't really see Parmenides as reacting in response to these ideas of generating substance burning into each other, but rather as a capstone to this concept of monistic reality. The other way that we can look at Parmenides is as a revolutionary who is breaking through with Heraclitus and Xenophanes and throwing out the now obsolete conceptions of the Milesian school. However, this doesn't necessarily capture the fact that these thinkers draw upon those Milesian concepts of the generating substances and then turn them back upon themselves to try and discover this underlying reality which is not perceivable to the human senses. The final way that we can look at Parmenides is as reactionary, not a revolutionary relying upon the thought of Heraclitus and Xenophanes, but someone that is reacting to Heraclitus, who he would see as proposing a system of radical flux. In this reading, Heraclitus isn't someone who is attempting to find unity in the underlying world, but rather someone that is proposing a radical form of pluralism, and Parmenides is reacting against that to create a radical form of unity. In my own estimation, I think that there is a more subtle relationship between those earlier Milesian thinkers who are attempting to find a mechanism for explaining reality, and then the later thinkers of Xenophanes, of Heraclitus and Parmenides, who start to reject the senses and the sensible as a guide to understanding the cosmos. Following the Parmenidean revolution, one of the first thinkers was Anaxagoras, who was the first person to bring from the Ionian coast to Athens philosophy. However, before his work and efforts, he was exiled for impiety. Now, we see Anaxagoras as a figure once again who attempts to create a cosmos from limited and unlimited factors. And he sees this unlimited everything as being directed and moulded by the mind, or what he would call nous. And another thinker following from Parmenides was a man by the name of Empedocles, who was from the south of Sicily. Now, he's a rather eccentric figure who's believed to have either claimed divinity or have claimed to be close to becoming a god, and who once again draws upon this Pythagorean concept of the transmigration of souls. And instead of positing this unity of opposites, or this unity of the limited and the unlimited, he saw a cyclic universe, created of those basic elements that were torn between love and strife as two formative and destructive powers. Now, in the standard view, Empedocles and Anaxagoras are seen as advocates of pluralism. In the wake of Parmenides, they're attempting to find a way that unity at a reality level can be combined with our conception and sensing of pluralism at a everyday level. Now, for Anaxagoras, he saw the unity of the universe existing in this complete and enmeshed everything, this unlimited factor. And he saw the nous, or the mind, as existing outside of this everything. And by being outside of the everything, he was able to conceive of the everything and to plan and control it through the use of a vortex. And this vortex, the motion caused by the nous, is what caused the separation of all these everythings into a series of opposites, which created the shapes that we experience in day-to-day life. Now, Empedocles, on the other hand, saw those same four Milesian substances of fire, earth, water, and air, and he saw them as being brought together through this metaphysical power of love. And as they were brought together, he saw sort of a primitive idea of evolution where limbs would be formed and then come together in random shapes. So you'd have humans with ox heads and ox with human heads, but only those creatures which were natural and good and wholesome would survive. But then as the unity of the universe continued, as this power of love continued to unify these different elements, eventually life would cease and all being would be together in this sphere-like substance, all-knowing and all-loving. But at this point, strife enters the universe and breaks apart this sphere and separates them out. Once again, you start having life, but eventually it separates out into the four bands of those elements, completely unmixed, are ready for the reinsertion of love to create, once again, the sphere of all-being and all-knowing. At the same time as Anaxagoras and Empedocles are attempting to push for pluralism, we see the followers of Parmenides defending their teacher's position. The first of the people defending this position is a man by the name of Zeno of Elea. He was famed for his paradoxes, which attempted to attack plurality as being inconsistent and essentially ridiculous. The first of Zeno's paradoxes is the paradox of the race. Now, it's important to note that Zeno isn't attempting to describe reality as we perceive it. He's attempting to describe what reality would be like if division is possible. So what Zeno is saying is, in a racer can go halfway to the finish point. And then he can halve the distance again to the finish point, having gone 3/4 of the way. And then he can halve that distance again. And he can keep halving it until infinity, but he can never reach the finishing point. He attempts once again to use another paradox in the form of Achilles and the tortoise. He's saying Achilles can attempt to catch the tortoise by moving to the tortoise's position, but by the time he gets to the tortoise's position, the tortoise has moved. And once again he attempts to catch the tortoise by moving to the tortoise's position, but once again the tortoise has moved, and so on to infinity. The final paradox, slightly different, is the paradox of the bow and arrow. When you see an arrow is fired at a target, as the arrow moves towards the target, If time is divisible, it can be divided down to a point where the arrow itself is no longer moving. And if the arrow is static in an infinite number of positions between the bow and the target, then how could the arrow itself move? The next follower of Parmenides is a man by the name of Melissus of Samos. Now, Melissus was a successful admiral during the Peloponnesian War, who fought against the Athenians and actually defeated Pericles of Athens. Now, he took Parmenides to an unlimited extreme, and what I mean by this is that Parmenides, although he was willing to accept the unity of being, was also willing to accept limits on said being. But Melissus was suggesting that being, in being, had to be infinite, because there could be no place there could not be, and as such, if there was only being, there was no way that being could move. It had to be immobile, because there was nothing for being to move into. So how have the Eleatic school, so those that have followed Parmenides of Elea, transformed his hypothesis, transformed his theory? So with Zeno, he's attempted to demonstrate with some very tricky paradoxes how the way that we perceive reality would be impossible if division was possible. And on the other hand, we have Melissus, who has put forward this theory that because of the infinite nature of being, movement is in and of itself impossible. And he's not saying that we don't perceive movement. He's saying that the movement we perceive is merely an illusion, and in reality, there is only one. So we now come to the point where we need to examine what exactly the relationship between these four philosophers is, between Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Zeno, and Melissus, and how they relate back to Parmenides. Now there is two basic conceptions, that of cousins and that of rivals. In the cousins theory, we have a weak Eleatic school, being Anaxagoras and Empedocles, who attempt to explain underlying unity with our perceptions of pluralism, and those who double down on the Parmenidean thesis with Zeno and Melissus, who just essentially attempt to build upon this conception of underlying unity. However, the other interpretation sees two rival schools, a monist school, following from Parmenides, including Zeno and Melissus, who is in conflict with the pluralists in the form of Anaxagoras and Empedocles. I am more inclined to this cousins interpretation, and the reason why is we see no definite rejection of the Parmenidean thesis by Empedocles or Anaxagoras, something we will see with our next philosophers, the 5th century atomists. The first of the atomists was possibly a man by the name of Leucippus of Miletus. It is believed that he was the founder of early atomism in Western philosophy, however sources conflict as to whether he actually existed. We are much more sure of the existence of Democritus, the student, or not, of Leucippus, who lived in the city of Abdera in northern Greece. He had this theory of atoms and the infinite void, which was an attempt to solve the problem which was presented by the Eleatic school. So when I say 5th century atomism, I'm not trying to refer to the particle physics which we think of in the modern world. What I'm referring to is an ancient philosophical system which attempts to explain how motion can exist in a world of plural entities. It suggests this thing, the atom, the indivisible, most minute of objects, of which there may be an infinite number. Now, this infinite number of objects composes, at the macro level, all the objects that we perceive through the sensory organs, and they are moved through flux or vortex. Now, in order for this movement to occur, and in order for there to be separation between these atoms, there has to be something for these objects to move into and to divide these atoms, and this must be the void. Hence, by suggesting that there is an element which cannot be cut, this solves Zeno's paradoxes. There is a most minute of distances which cannot be reduced, and by posing the void as something that exists between these most minute of objects, it suggests a solution to Melissus's problem of the infinite nature of being. At the same time as the 5th century atomists are attempting to solve the problem of the Eleatic school, we see the last of the substance philosophers in the form of Diogenes of Apollonia, which is on the coast of the Black Sea. Now, for some people, they see him as a bit of a throwback to the Milesian school, who believed in air as the universal substance. Now, they see his concept of thought as somewhat obsolete at this period, although I want to show that I think in some ways he was a great synthesizer that actually brought about a style of thinking and a theory which revolutionized and incorporated both the Parmenidean and the Milesian schools. So for Diogenes, he saw air as this intelligent and universal substance, and as such, some people see him as somewhat derivative, taking his ideas from Anaximenes. However, I want to suggest that it's not necessarily this idea of a generating substance, but of an underlying substance, of a material monism that attempts to unify the Eleatic and Milesian positions. So for him, air, when rarefied, so in a small amount, when it's spread out, would become fire. But when more air was compressed together, it would become water. And when even more air was pressed together, it would become earth. Now there's a subtle difference between this and the earlier Milesian thinkers. The air itself doesn't change. The water is merely comprised of compressed air. And the fire is comprised of stretched out air. The air itself doesn't change, the air still exists, it merely exists in a denser or in a more rarefied substance. And with this air, we see the Parmenidean one. All things are comprised of the one material, the one fabric. It is merely differences of density throughout the cosmos which creates the perception of motion and the perception of pluralism. Now, while Diogenes and the atomists are trying to solve the Parmenidean problem, we see a new school of thought erupting in Greece, and although it comes from many quarters, it centralizes itself in Athens. And this is the school of the Sophists. Now, some people have argued that the Sophists have very little in common besides their name, but I want to try and show that there is some overarching unifying factors between these many different wandering rhetoricians. The first, and probably the most famous of the earliest Sophists that we'll talk about, is Protagoras. Now, Protagoras came from Abdera, the same place as Heraclitus, and he saw man as the measure of all things. Now, what does Protagoras mean when he talks about man being the measure of all things? Well, what he's talking about is, in some ways, a form of cultural relativism. So the Greek world was relatively multicultural for the time. We're talking about a world which borders upon the rich and powerful empires of Persia, which had incorporated those aspects of Babylonian and later Egyptian thought, and also those areas which were now occupied by Carthaginians and eventually would come to form parts of the Roman Empire. Now, they had exposure to all these different cultures, and so for Protagoras, he starts to push forward this idea that perhaps the laws which we see as being divinely instituted are actually just the conventions of man. And I'll talk to another very famous relativist at the same time, the historian Herodotus, and one of the stories he uses to try and highlight the very particular and very relative nature of human laws. Now, he talks about the Greeks, and the Greeks have the custom of burning the dead. However, he then talks about, in his great work, The Histories, of these people, the Chalatai, who live in India, who instead of burning their dead, practice funerary cannibalism. And when they hear about the fact that the Greeks burn the dead, they are absolutely mortified. Of course, they see this as a great sacrilege. Instead of consuming the bodies of the dead, they are burning them. And at the same time, the Greeks were equally horrified by the idea of people that would consume the bodies of their loved ones. And so what they're trying to say is that these laws that we see as being so solid and so important in our lives actually have only basis in cultural relativity. The second most famous of the early sophists was a man by the name of Gorgias, who came from Sicily and claimed that virtue could not be taught. And he didn't claim it in a sense that virtue couldn't be taught because it couldn't be transmitted from one person to another, but he rather claimed that virtue couldn't exist because of the relative nature of this virtue between people. In fact, he took it to an extreme. You could be seen as claiming that there was a cosmology of nothingness. There was nothing that was of true value. In this sense, Gorgias represents an anti-Parmenides. In some ways, he's the first Greek thinker to really grasp the radical nature of the being of Parmenides. He's grasped how this single unified one can only really be argued against from a position of nothingness. If there is only one thing in the theory of Parmenides, in Gorgias there is only nothing. And this radical nothingness is corrosive in its nature. It undermines any sort of conception of value, of ethics, of any sort of positivist philosophy, something that posits a theory of being, a theory of motion, or a theory of the good life. Now, it may seem that with the first two sophists that we're talking about rather corrosive thinkers who are undermining the traditional values not only of Greece, but the traditional values of thinking that made it possible to put forward a theory. However, it's important to realize that they are a rather varied school. Prodicus, the nest thinker, actually argued that virtue must be taught, and he saw that religion is something that could be interpreted through nature. For Prodicus, nature was the source in which religion could be found. And in this sense, he's not saying that there's some sort of primitive conception of animism where we look for the spirits of nature to guide us. What he's saying is that the natural world is the guide which can be utilized as an underlying basis for the cosmos. And with this, he also saw intentionality as important. He saw that tools themselves didn't have moral value. It was the mechanism by which they were utilized that imparted them the value that they demonstrated. And with this, he saw a similarity between humans and tools. He saw that humans had to be taught how to act virtuously, and that in their natural state, they were neither with or without virtue. The next sophist we'll talk about is Hippias of Elis, who came from the Peloponnese. He saw self-sufficiency as the goal of life. There's a story in which he turned up to an Olympiad wearing and carrying only objects of his own manufacture. So this included the clothing he wore, the amphorae in which he carried olive oil, and the tripod on which he made sacrifices. By some theorists' account, he is also the originator of the concept of natural law. So what do I mean by natural law? So natural law is this conception of the radical unity of humanity as a unity of type. And so Hippias is attempting to demonstrate that through his writings there is no real difference between humans. He doesn't necessarily go as far as saying that slaves are the same as all freemen, but he definitely alludes to this kind of thinking when he talks about the fact that the aristocrats and those that work in the field have no real difference of type. And this is an extremely important theory because it prefigures some of the later liberationist and abolitionist theories that would become so important in the 19th century. So the last of the sophists that we'll talk about is Antiphon, the sophist who came from Athens as far as we can tell. Now, he is sometimes seen as the defender of liberty and freedom. The reason why Antiphon is described as such a defender is because in his writing it appears that he's alluding to the fact that nature requires liberty. And what this means is that he sees the natural state as abhorring oppression, as abhorring being oppressed by another superior in strength and power. So we now come to the point where we need to examine the sophists as a whole. And I need to reinforce the fact that the sophists have a very bad reputation due to later writers, in particular Plato, who sees them as charlatans, as people that steal people's money with no real intention of providing virtue or benefit. Now, in some ways, this is a very one-sided interpretation of these very diverse thinkers, and I think it's better to re-examine them in light of their own writings. Gorgias is a brilliant mind. He acts as a fierce counterpoint to that very radical being of Parmenides. But the corrosive nature of his discovery, the corrosive nature of his theory, is something that has been, in some ways, I would say, rightfully condemned by later thinkers. Although it does point to that very challenging conception of the emptiness of value. Protagoras, on the other hand, has a somewhat softer critique of the positivist philosophies and theories of his day, attempting to demonstrate how all those conceptions of virtue, of law, and of right are really just based upon our cultural conceptions. Prodicus tries to provide another basis on which we can put our morals and our religion on a firm footing. And he sees that as nature. And it appears that Hippias and Antiphon extrapolate upon this conception of nature as a basis for ethics to point towards and prefigure some of those later conceptions of liberty and freedom. The last of the early Greek thinkers that I want to examine in this episode is Socrates. And I'm not going to go into any great depth because he, along with his very famous student Plato, really deserve their own episode. Now, Socrates left none of his own writings, and so we have to rely upon Plato, his student, who provides a very vivid and a very important portrait of the man in his dialogues. And the reason that I want to talk about Socrates here is we need to see Socrates as a product of these early Greek philosophers. He did not come to the world ex nihilo. He came to us as a product of these vibrant, diverse, and in some ways challenging intellectual climate of the early Greek philosophers. So finally, I want to examine some of the key issues that arise out of the early Greek philosophers. And I note that you've listened through this entire episode, so I'd like to hope that I'm preaching to the choir in some ways when I talk about the importance of these thinkers. Now, some of the first issues to consider is the issue of originality. Now, it has been argued somewhat recently that these thinkers are merely derivative, having taken their ideas from the Egyptians, from the Babylonians, and potentially from the Indians. And this is a very persuasive theory in some sense, because yes, these thinkers are very reliant upon the mathematics and the astronomy of those great civilizations that went before them. However, I also think it's important that we note that there is something intensely original about the abstraction of these Greek thinkers, but also of the way in which they reject tradition and custom as a mechanism by which to explain the cosmos. And this isn't to suggest that other cultures haven't done this. There are some Indian thinkers and Chinese thinkers who also tackle these same problems and tackle them in surprisingly similar manners. But for those of us in the West, I think it's important that we understand our own intellectual furniture and understand the roots of these ideas that have challenged and propelled Western society throughout the ages. The second issue we need to talk about is the relevancy of studying the early Greek philosophers. Now, I will admit it's not likely that we'll find in the Milesian school some form of theory that is going to explain the reality of the cosmos when compared to modern physics. However, I think it's important that we understand these early Greek philosophers because they form the nest which nurtures the great mind of Socrates and Plato, who forms really the fountain point from which pours forth all of Western philosophy. However, in their own right, these early Greek philosophers are important. They influenced later thinkers such as Nietzsche, and also they provided a radical understanding of the cosmos that is still difficult to both comprehend and to argue against today. Zeno's paradoxes are still as compelling an argument for the radical oneness of nature, and it's still modern particle physics which attempts to undermine this conception of reality, while at the same time going through its own issues, where we've seen the corpuscular theory thrown out with the splitting of the atom, which in itself, those subatomic particles have once again been split down into quarks, and then again split down into even smaller particles. So we have been fooled before, and to think that we stand upon a purely solid basis of science that can easily explain the very nature of reality is to reject the very real and ongoing process of science attempting to understand the nature and fabric of the universe. It's important as well to think about how radical these thinkers are. They're going against decades, centuries, millennia of custom, of tradition, of religion, and they pay for it in many cases. People like Pythagoras, people like the Sophists, and people like Socrates end up on the wrong side of mob justice, on the wrong side of public malcontent, and it helps to remind us of how dangerous original thinking can be. Overall, I would say that I cannot read and I cannot interpret the early Greek thinkers for you. I can only give you a bit of an aperture through which you can begin to understand the way that they interact. And I highly recommend that in your own time you read through some of their original fragments and then through some of the selected books that I've put down below, which provide some interpretations of the way that their thoughts interact. I would like to thank you for watching this episode of Foolish Musings, and I hope that you continue to watch the channel and also read my blog at foolishmusings.com.